Hello folks, and welcome to the channel, or welcome back, and this is part number 3 of the rack and pinion. But as you all know, once we started with the rack and pinion, we started to rebuild the complete front suspension system and the crossmember of the MGB GT. And in this part we're going to continue to do so. So we're going to rebuild many different things, we're going to clean up more things, and we're going to assemble things. So let me give you a little overview of what we're going to do in this video. And the first thing we're going to do is to rebuild the lower wishbone. So on the right hand side I have the old wishbone with the spring, and on the left hand side I'm having a brand new kit to reassemble a brand new wishbone. And it comes in all different pieces, but don't worry about it, we're going to talk about it and I'll show you how we put it together. We're also going to change all the bushes on it with polyterrain bushes, a lot better than the old rubber bushes, but more of that later. We will prepare the crossmember and get it installed using polyterrain pads, new bolts, and then we lock it all down to the chassis. And of course we're going to install the rack and pinion. This is going to be a pretty busy video. So without any further ado, let's start with putting the new lower wishbone together. So here we have the old wishbone, and I'm not going to put this one back. I will assemble a brand new one. And you can buy all these parts separately, they're not that expensive. So the spring, well, that's a fairly good spring. I don't need to replace that one, so let me move that aside. As you can see, this old wishbone is having quite some wear and tear on the bushes. Even if I wanted to reuse it, I would have to have changed the bushes. So that's why I decided not to rebuild it, but to get all new parts for it. Now, the part here in the front, this is not a standard part. This is part of the modification for the Costello suspension. That's where the shock goes in. So the pan where the shock sits in typically only has 2 holes. So I had to drill an additional hole in my old one and also in the new one, and you'll see that in a few minutes. But in your case, that might not be the situation. So now let's have a look on the new parts, what it is all about. Here we have all the new parts. We have the 2 side arms. There's a left one and a right one. There is a difference, and that's that part right there, that piece that is welded in, the trapezium. The longer side has to be facing down. This is the pan for the spring, and this is the hole I had to drill extra because there wasn't one in there to adapt my Costello suspension. It comes with bolts to bolt it down together, so I laid it out more or less on how it's supposed to fit together. And then here we have the bushes, and these are polyterrain bushes that I'm using. They are very different than the normal rubber bushes, so if you're going to fit those, you need to use the steel insert, and you have to push it in a little bit. And then you need to use special grease, and inside these bushes you have kind of like a little grit, a mesh, and inside there, that's where you have to put the grease in. Now don't put any ordinary grease up because that's going to destroy the bushes. So you need to use special grease for polyterrain bushes. The first thing that I'm going to do is to install the arm of the wishbone onto the pivot. And therefore I need to use a steel tube that will slide over this pivot point here. I will grease this up with anti-corrosion grease so we can slide that on. You then have a PU rubber that goes over this tube, and another one on the other side, and in the middle you will find actually your pivoting arm. Let me put this quickly together for you so you can actually see it without really mounting it. So the PU parts are going into the eye of the wishbone arm. Steel insert goes in there, and then the whole wishbone arm goes over that part like so. So it's going to go over like this. And you might have to push that a bit because it's really made to size, and once all that is in place, then of course we'll lock it down and we are done. So if you look inside the polyterrain bush, you see that it's kind of hatched, and that is to retain the grease that comes with the polyterrain bushes. You shouldn't be using any other grease because you can destroy the polyterrain. Another important point is that this steel bush that goes over the pivot is not the one that's going to rotate while the wishbone arm goes up and down. It is not. It is actually the polyurethane bushing that rotates actually onto the outer side of this steel sleeve. That's why the grease has to be there. So the first thing I'm going to do is to put some anti-corrosion grease up. Again, not on the bush itself, but actually on the inner side of the pivot point. So I'm going to put some grease inside the bush, and for that I'm using a small brush, not to spill too much. Because I need grease for about 4 of those. So that should be enough. So now I'm going to try to get the steel insert inside the bush, and now that is in. And that can be a bit of squeezing, but overall this goes very smoothly. And then the last one, we will try to get it in from the top. So that is in, and now we install the whole thing onto the pivot, like so. Now we're going to bolt it down so that these bushes have been pushed together a bit, because you really want to push on that tube. So I fitted the bushes on both sides. I tightened it up a little bit so they would settle. Now I'm going to release it a bit so we can actually fit the pan. And the pan is what we refer to as the spring pan. This is the spring pan. That's the one that needs to go in here. And we need to have a little bit of play to get the bolts in. Alright, the easiest way to get the pan is to flip it upside down, because the bolts and the nuts are at the inside. So on one side you have 2 bolts, and on the other side you only have 1. So let's put the bolts through. This is nothing really special. This is pretty simple, straightforward work. And then we're just going to bolt this down. And when it's bolted down, we will tighten up again the pivot bolts. Alright. Next one. At the back here. And that's all there is to it, guys. There is nothing more to do than just bolting these down and then installing the mounting point for the shock absorber. Now before you bolt down the bolts, push down everything on a flat surface so it's really flush, so the pivot and the arms, and then start bolting them down. Alright. Also going to install the drop link, because that's the other part that holds together the lower wishbones. Alright. Just gonna lock it up. We won't adjust it yet. That's something that we will do when it's on the car, but right now I want to make sure that it's on there so the wishbones are kept together properly. And in addition, there is a bolt underneath for my shock absorber, so I need to make sure that that one is fitted properly, otherwise we have a bit of an issue. So let's flip it over and install the plate for the shock absorber. And that's where this one is going. And I'm going to put the bolts from the top. And now it's just putting the nuts up and we are done, right? We've completed just one wishbone and everything is new except the mounting bracket for the shock absorber. This is the original one, but that was not that old anyway. We also installed a new downlink. For the rest, everything is actually new. I haven't bolted down yet the bolts on the pivot. I still have to put in the split pins, but I'll do that once it's installed on the car, because I might have to open up the wishbone a little bit to get the upright right there in the middle. But for the rest, I think this is looking quite good, and it will certainly last its time. So before I'm going to install my cross member, I'm going to heat wrap the exhaust pipe. It was heat wrapped before, however that heat wrap was worn and torn apart. So now I'm going to apply a new layer of heat wrap. And this is heat wrap, and this comes in many different types and forms. This one is specifically for about 1,000 degrees centigrade. You can get them for much higher temperatures, so that depends a bit where you do it on the car. I'm already a little bit away from the collector, so the gases have cooled down a bit. And you probably wonder why you want to heat wrap your exhaust pipe or your exhaust manifold. Well, the reason for that is that you're going to get a little bit better performance out of the engine, number one. And number two, it's going to keep the heat away from your engine compartment. Now, I know here it's sitting next to the wheel, but I'm going to keep that heat away from the wheel actually, and also the engine compartment, because it goes underneath. So that's why I do heat wrapping, and that can be up to 70%. The question that I get often asked is, how much heat wrap do you need? Well, there is a very simple rule of thumb to figure that out. First of all, you measure the total length of the pipe. So let's say this is 100, and it doesn't matter if it's centimeters or inches, it's 100. We also know that one wrapping around the pipe is having a certain length, and that would be that length we just wrapped around it. And let's say in this case this is 10. And we also know that the heat wrapping has a certain width, and let's say this is 5. Now, since we are going to heat wrap the exhaust, we will overlap 50%, right? So in other words, one turn is only 2.5, because it is 5, but we divide it by 2, so it's 2.5. So now we had a total length of 100 divided by 2.5. That's 40 turns we'll have to do to get to the end. And every turn was 10. So you multiply 40 by 10. So now you know the total length. The total length is 400 of heat wrap. This is the length you're going to need to do this job. Always add a little bit more, because when you start up, you do kind of double turning, and at the end, you most likely do the same. So without any further ado, let's start wrapping it up. All right, so let's start. In the beginning, it can be a little bit difficult to do it, but once that is going, it becomes fairly easy. You probably noticed when I said in the beginning, we have some double wrapping, and that's what we've done so far. All right. As you can see, I'm really pulling on it. This is how we keep going. Now I've gone already some distance. I'm just going to put a tie wrap up now in the beginning. Of course, I'm not going to keep tie wraps because that's plastic. I will put a metal band on there, but I will hold it while we're wrapping. And it's good to have some gloves on. I didn't have them on initially, but you should put them on. And this is a bit annoying that you have to pull it through every time, but the further you go, the shorter it becomes. So and I keep checking how much I'm overlapping. All right. So folks, let me continue wrapping this, and then I'll show you the end result. So as you can see, I finished up wrapping the pipe, and it's tight, and this is how it's supposed to be. I already have put up a clamp halfway and one at the end. not over here, so I still have to remove the tie wrap here and then put a clamp up. Now you don't need to put stainless steel clamps up. You can have stainless steel small metal strips like I have somewhere else on this car, but I'm not using those anymore because they tend to come loose, and I do prefer the bigger type of stainless steel bands to go on there, because that way it will stay on there and it's not going to move. And here you see some of those smaller stainless steel tie wraps basically. But I'm going to use a tie wrap, or whatever you want to call it, a band or a clamp, which is a bit stronger, and this is the one, and this is also stainless steel, by the way. So let me put this up here, and then we're going to lock this down, and we should be good. And the reason for that is I have ample of space here, so there's no constraint, and this is not going to go anywhere. Next, I'm going to paint the wire wrap with heat protective paint. You don't need to do this, but it's recommended because it's protecting the heat wrap very well. But make sure you have heat resistant paint for that. Now you can get these in black. I only had white left because I had it from a previous project, so that's why I used the white one. But I'm going to paint it with black on this car. Both sides of the exhaust, we got brand new heat wrap on it and we painted it. So now we are ready to continue with the cross member. In the previous episode we shot blasted the cross member and then we repainted it. And now it's basically ready to be installed. But there are a few things you need to know about the cross member. There's a difference between a chrome bumper and a rubber bumper. And the difference is actually in the fixing bolts, and I'll show you those in a minute. But these are the fixing bolts. So there's one bolt in the back, there's one bolt in the front, there's one bolt in the back, there's one bolt in the front, and these bolts are holding the cross member towards the frame. And it's important that the cross member is isolated from the frame to avoid vibrations and sound. And that's why you're going to need these pads that will go in there all around this cross member fixing. And that's very important, and I'm going to show you on how to install that in a few seconds with a close-up. So first of all, let's have a look on the bolts, then on how we mount the bolts and the pads, and then something more about the front bolt, because that's a bit special. This is the bolt of the front mounting point on a chrome bumper MGB. And look on this offset and the concave part. Now the concave part is the part that has to fit into the frame of the vehicle. The second bolt I have here is the bolt from the back. Now what I show you is not how you should mount them, but look on this offset, how much shorter that is versus that one. You still have the concave part, but the offset is a lot less. And that's why it's important that these bolts are mounted in the right way. So if you have a chrome bumper, remember that the front bolt, the bolt facing the radiator, is the one with the largest offset. And I'm going to show you why that is. The rear bolt comes through this opening right here. And as you can see, there is no stud or anything. And that's why that offset is so small. If I'm going to show you the other side, then you'll see it's different. That's the mounting position for the front bolt. And you can see already this bush here, right? This is the offset you have. That's why the offset on the bolt in the front is so much longer. The bolts are mounted in a very specific way. You have to have this metal plate on the bottom, the locking nut, and then you also need to have a spacer or a silencer or whatever you want to call this. This is a pad, and I use polyterene pads, and the pad needs to go on like this. So with the little collar upwards, because that collar has to fit right into that hole, like so. That's where it should fit. So now I can put the bolt through, line it up, and then on the top you want to have another pad, like so. And you need to have that because this way the cross member, which is this part here, is isolated from the frame, which is sitting here. So on both sides you have kind of a absorbing pad, I would say. Here this bolt will go through the member of the chassis, and on the top we just install the nut and a big washer, and that's it. Now there's one more thing I need to talk about. The rear bolt adds a piece of cake to install. You have fairly easy access. The front bolt, that's a completely different story. So installing the front bolt is very similar to the rear bolt, except the fact that you can't get to it without removing the spring here. So I've been looking on the best way to mount the cross member, and I came to the conclusion that the best way is to pre-mount the bolts inside the frame. And this is the bolt actually. So what I've done is I took off the nuts. There we go. And I did slide it through the frame here. Then on the top I placed my washer on it and a bolt. So it actually, I could bolt it down into the chassis, because what is important is that this conic part is actually fitted properly into the frame here or the chassis. So those two are bolted down already, and I think it's going to be a lot easier by moving up that subframe into those two than trying to do that through the subframe. But we'll see how that goes. Now let me show you on the other side on how I'm going to install this one, because I already done those two and one on the other side, but I'm going to show you one in the front here on how that has been fitted. So here's that bolt, and remember this is the long offset in the front. That's the conic part that needs to go in that hole. I'm going to slide that in there. That's number one. We're going to put a washer all the way on the top, and for that one I can't show you that because that's behind this beam here. And I'm going to put this locking nut on the top. That's important. And it might be a little bit of fiddling, but we will get it on there. That's a good thing about new bolts and nuts. That works fine. But now I still have some play, of course, and that's just because it's a locking nut. So what I'm going to do now is put two nuts on the bottom here against each other. We call that a counter nut, and then I can actually use this to turn or to tighten the nut on the top. But I will have to put those two pretty well together. This is a 19, by the way, just in case you were wondering what kind of wrenches I was using. All right, so that's good enough. And now I'm going to try to hold the top nut. There isn't a lot of space up there, so a wrench like this is very handy. So now it's in the locking position, so let me do that. And that's not an easy place to get at, but let's see. Yeah, I got it. So now I'll just need to turn it on this side until the conic part is all the way in, right? You don't have a lot of room on the top to turn the wrench, but I have some. Now I'm just going to lock it into place. In fact, I don't even have to hold it anymore. All right. Okay, good. So that is in place. So all I need to do now is to remove those two nuts, and I should be good to go. And now I can slide on my PU pad. Yeah, that's it. And I can do it on all four, and then I can bring up my cross member. So the PU pads are in place, so actually we're about ready to install the cross member. You might notice that I have another additional spacer here. This is like a 2.5 to 3 mil spacer, and I needed this to lower my steering house a bit. So if I bring my cross member 2 or 3 millimeter lower, then of course my steering house, which is mounted to my cross member, is also going to come about 2 to 3 millimeters lower, which is enough to give me the clearance for the rod which is going underneath the exhaust. It's all very tight on this car because this is a modified car. This is not an original engine. This is a conversion to a V8. So then you may have to do sometimes these kind of small adaptations. So let's see if we can get this cross member installed. then the work is a bit easier because you can just lift it up and then the other guy can bolt it down. But in my case, I don't have that luxury, so I need to have a dummy aid, as we call it. Let's see if I can get it more or less into place. Yeah, that bolt, all the bolts are fitting. That's good. So I might as well push it a bit higher. See if I have space. Yeah, I do. All right, let's see. Space, yeah. In fact, I could do it like this. And hold it. Okay. So that is very well in place. So now it's a matter of bolting it down from the bottom. So this is where the rear bolt fits. But as you can see, we need to shuffle it around a bit because I still have to put this padding in, and it has to go in the hole, right, around the bolt. My hands were probably in the way, and then finally we need to install this metal plate, and there is an indent, as you can see. This is the indent. That's the side that has to face the frame. So okay, that's number one. So I have the cross member in place, and I didn't lock down the nuts on the bolts. The bolt in the back was easy, but the bolt in the front, well, you have to maneuver your hand inside this opening here where the spring normally sits, and then put the padding up, the PU padding, then put the bolt up as I've shown you, together with the metal plate. But you can get access to it, it's not that bad. But I didn't lock down the nuts on the bottom because I want to have a bit of play, because I need to put in my steering rack here, and you know I have no sufficient space here to put it in because of this pulley wheel here. So let me lower that down a bit and you will see that it's still fairly loose. All right, see, I still have a bit of play with it, so I should be able to slide in my steering rack after I have actually positioned it in the central position. As you could see, we almost finished installing the cross member, but it's not entirely installed. I didn't lock it down. I still have quite a bit of play, so it's kind of loose because I want to be able to fit the steering rack. And you might remember from a previous video that I didn't have a lot of space between the steering rack and the metal pulley, which is in front of the crankshaft. So that's why I leave it hanging down a bit, not bolting it down, and that's the cross member. And I'm going to install, first of all, or pre-position the steering rack. Now, before I can actually install the steering rack, I want to make sure that it's exactly in the middle position. And let me show you that on how I do that. So what I'm going to do now is turn the steering wheel to the extreme left. All right, so that's the extreme left. Now I'm going to measure from a fixed point, and I'm going to use this point here all the way to the end of the tie rod, and that's about 47.5, and I'm going to mark this on a piece of paper. It doesn't really matter what it is, centimeters or inches. Now I'm going to turn it completely in the other direction and all the way to the end. And from the same reference point, I'm going to measure. Now that's 32.5. So 32.5. Now the difference between those two is 15. Now I'm going to divide this by 2. So I know at 7.5 from my reference point, that is my middle position. So that's what I'm going to do right now. I think that must be almost it. So let's measure from the reference point. And I measure 40. So 32.5 plus 7.5, that is exactly 40. So I know it's now in the middle position. So here's our steering rack that we have centered. Now let's see if we can move this guy in. This is just a trial fit, so it's not the final fit yet. And it looks like we can get it in. We can even pass by the pulley here. So that's good news. I'm going to put some small tie wraps up so it doesn't fall down while we work on it. All right, so let's see if that's going to work or not. It may be a little bit too short, maybe. Oh, no, that will work. So I can slide it back a little bit if I need to get the rod into the connection towards the steering column. All right. It may not be enough. I might not be able to move it enough. That's possible. Maybe not far enough. We'll see. Now for that, I will need to lower the car and check it from the inside. So the trick now is to connect the rod, which is coming from the rack and pinion, towards the steering house. And that's where we have the U-joint. And that's all the way below there. And I can't see it for the moment. Oh yes, there it is. So let's see if we can hook that up or not. That's going to be interesting. Now, if I'm going to do so, I want to make sure that my steering wheel is in the right position. So position the steering wheel right as you were driving straight forward. We have aligned the steering house, so that should be good. So let's see if we can get this done. And this is not going to be easy. All right, I need to move it back even more. So these tie wraps are too tight. Unfortunately, I couldn't show you what I've done because there is no space there to film anything. The exhaust is in the way, the spark plugs are in the way, everything is in the way to get the steering rod, which is coming from the rack and pinion, into that cross joint. And the cross joint is going to the steering column. And it's kind of grooved, so you have to align it and get it in. So I had to push the steering rack from underneath the car, push it upwards, get it aligned here on that cross joint, which kept on moving. So this was a little bit of fiddling. I think if you do this with two people, it will be a lot easier to do than on your own. One could push on the bottom, the other one could guide it over here. But I think the steering wheel is still straight. So that looks good. So what I'm going to do now is gently put that bolt in there to lock that into place so it can't slip out. And then we'll lift the car up again and we're going to most likely start locking down the cross member, but also put some bolts on the steering house just to see if everything is aligned. Because you have to make sure that the steering house rod is aligned with the steering column. So now I'm going to install the bolts on the rack and pinion, but I'm not going to tighten them down yet because I still have to push up the cross member with the bolts. But I just want to make sure that all the bolts are fitting properly in the rack and pinion and before I do anything else. So it's always a good check. This was a little bit of fiddling, but at the end it all fell in place. If I could have done this with two people, especially trying to get the steering rod into the steering column, that U-joint, that would have been so much easier. So I have come to the point where I can now actually tighten down the cross member. All right. Well, let's see if everything still fits as it should, because it may have slipped a bit. How is this inside? I need to check it inside there. That still feels good. And this is a very hard nut to get at. But it will work at the end. Locking down the front nut of the cross member is now so easy. With the spring in place, That would not have been possible whatsoever. Oh, let's see how the steering column is going, because I need to check on these things. All right, so that looks good. Okay.